It's a story whispered in the darkest corners of our town, a tale of true horror that still sends shivers down my spine every time I recall it. One stormy night, as the rain battered the windows and the wind howled through the trees, I found myself alone in a dimly lit cabin deep in the woods. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and I sat by the fireplace, the flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Little did I know, I was about to hear a series of unsettling stories from a stranger who sought refuge that very night. A knock on the door drew my attention, and there, standing drenched and trembling, was a mysterious man. His clothes were soaked, and his eyes held a haunted look that sent a shiver down my spine. He introduced himself as Victor and claimed he had a collection of horrifying stories that he needed to share. With each tale, he whispered a captivating hook, weaving us deeper into a world of terror. Have you ever heard of the abandoned asylum that stands at the edge of our town? Victor began, his voice quivering. The one where they experimented on the patients, delving into the darkest realms of the human mind. Many say it's haunted, but the spirits there aren't the ones you should fear. It's the experiments they left behind. As he continued, the atmosphere grew colder, and I couldn't help but listen intently as Victor recounted conversations he'd had with those who had dared to explore the asylum. The stories were filled with eerie voices, cries for help, and desperate pleas from entities that should never exist. Victor's second story was even more disturbing. He spoke of a cursed family whose members had been plagued by a sinister entity for generations. The curse had begun with a simple Ouija board session, an innocent attempt to communicate with the other side. But the entity they had contacted was far from friendly. The entity, known as Malakar, thrived on fear, Victor whispered, his voice barely audible over the relentless rain outside. It possessed each family member in turn, using their bodies to wreak havoc on the living. And when it spoke through them, it was as if the very gates of hell had been opened. I couldn't help but wonder how these stories were connected, and with bated breath, I waited for the next tale. Victor leaned in closer, his eyes filled with dread, and began to tell the most terrifying story yet. There's a place, he said, known as the Whispering Grove. Legends say it's the site of an ancient ritual, where dark forces were summoned to grant unimaginable power. Those who dared to venture into the grove at night have reported hearing hushed conversations from the shadows. Conversations that predict their doom, down to the very date and time. As Victor spoke of the whispers in the grove, I could swear I heard faint voices echoing in the distance, despite our isolation in the woods. It was as if the stories had taken on a life of their own, seeping into our very reality. But it was the final story that left us all in a state of sheer horror. Victor's voice trembled as he recounted an encounter with a sinister figure known as the Midnight Man, a being who could drive a person to madness. The Midnight Man, Victor said, waits in the darkest corners of your home, just beyond your sight. He feeds on your fear, and when he speaks, it's a conversation that can drive you to the brink of insanity. But the worst part is that once you know about him, you're forever on his radar. As Victor concluded his tales, he looked around the dimly lit cabin, his eyes wide with terror. The storm outside raged on, and the room seemed to grow colder with each passing moment. It was then that we realized the true horror of the stories. The lines between reality and the supernatural had blurred, and the cabin felt like it was no longer a safe haven. The room grew colder, and Victor's voice trembled as he began his next tale, the third and most unsettling of all. Have you ever walked through the streets of our town on a foggy night, my friends? Victor inquired, his eyes glistening with unease. Have you ever noticed the shadowy figures that seem to drift just beyond your peripheral vision, their features obscured by the mist? Those are the Watchers of the Fog, and their presence is an omen of impending doom. As Victor continued, his words painted a vivid picture of the Watchers of the Fog. They were said to be the spirits of those who had met gruesome ends, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. These lost souls were cursed to roam our town, their whispered conversations filled with despair, their eyes brimming with a hunger for revenge. I couldn't help but glance towards the window, where the fog outside seemed to thicken. The eerie feeling of being watched crept over me, and I shivered as Victor's tale reached its sinister climax. "These entities feed on the fear of those who acknowledge them," Victor whispered, his voice barely audible. "The more you fear them, the closer they come to claiming your soul. And when they speak, it's not just a conversation, it's an invitation to join them in the ever-encroaching darkness." As the fire crackled and the rain continued to pour, Victor moved on to his next story, one that would leave us all in a state of pure dread. "Have you ever ventured into the old cemetery at the edge of town?" Victor asked, his eyes locked on mine. "Some say it's cursed, and that the tombstones conceal a malevolent force that hungers for the living. Those who visit the cemetery at night have reported hearing conversations among the dead, conversations that foretell their own demise." The very thought sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but imagine the desolate cemetery, where the tombstones loomed like silent sentinels in the moonlight. Victor's words seemed to draw me into that eerie place, where whispers in the dark revealed the gruesome fates of those who had dared to step foot on its sacred ground. The tombstones themselves are said to be etched with the names of those who will meet a grisly end, Victor said, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "And if you listen closely, you may hear the conversations of the dead, for they know the secrets of your fate. They know when and how you will meet your end." As Victor concluded this macabre tale, the room felt oppressively silent, as if the very air had thickened with dread. It was clear that his stories were not mere fiction, they were a glimpse into a world where the supernatural and the living converged in a tapestry of true horror. But it was the final story, the one that would haunt our nightmares for years to come, that Victor reserved for last. With a trembling hand, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a weathered journal, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and ominous illustrations. "Behold, the Journal of the Damned," Victor declared, his voice barely more than a whisper. "This journal contains the stories of those who have glimpsed the abyss, those who have heard the conversations of the malevolent entities that lurk in the shadows. It's a record of unspeakable horrors that will forever change the reader." As Victor opened the journal, its pages seemed to come to life, the symbols dancing and shifting in the dim light. He began to read from it, and the words sent shivers down our spines. The conversations within the journal were not just words, they were a descent into madness, a dark descent that seemed to pull us all into its depths. We listened in terror as the journal spoke of a world where the lines between the living and the dead were blurred, a world where malevolent entities held terrifying conversations with the souls of the unfortunate. The horrors described within were beyond comprehension, and as Victor concluded his reading, the room felt as if it were closing in on us. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind howling like a chorus of tormented souls. We were all frozen in fear, unable to escape the true horror that had enveloped us. The mysteries surrounding these stories still haunt me, and I share them with you, dear listeners, with the hope that they will leave you in a state of perpetual dread, for in the world of true horror, the unknown can be the most terrifying of all. And as I look back on that fateful night, I am left with a chilling realization that the stories Victor shared were not mere tales. They were windows into a world of darkness, where the boundaries of reality and nightmare blended, leaving us in a state of perpetual fear. So, my dear listeners, beware the whispers in the fog, the conversations of the dead, and the sinister figures that lurk in the shadows, for the true horror of the unknown is a force that can never truly be escaped. It lingers in the corners of our minds, waiting to remind us that the line between reality and nightmare is razor thin, and the malevolent entities are always watching, always listening, always ready to claim their next victim.